They were afraid of something far older than kingdoms, older than flags, older than borders. They feared power, not the kind that comes from swords or crowns, but something far more dangerous, the power of identity, of resilience, of a people who refuse to be erased. For centuries, the very existence of African people has been treated as a threat not because of what they did, but because of what they represented: the unknown, the untamed, the unconquerable. But why? Why has the African identity carried this shadow of fear, suspicion, and distortion across history? Tonight, we tear into a wound that history tried to stitch closed. This isn't about blame. It's not about fueling division or feeding guilt. This is about confronting uncomfortable truths that still breathe beneath the surface of our world today. Because behind every myth, behind every stereotype and whisper, lies a carefully constructed narrative, one designed to control how the world sees African people and how African people see themselves. The legacy of the psychological warfare stretches from the first foreign ships on African shores to boardrooms, media, and classrooms across continents. But make no mistake, the story you're about to hear is not folklore. It is not ancient fiction. It is a living ghost, one that still shapes the fates of millions. And I must warn you, the deeper we go, the more unsettling it gets. We will explore the unspoken strategies, the quiet manipulations, the systemic fears, and the mind-bending consequences that followed. So before we descend into this shadowed history, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Let's create a global conversation as we pull back the veil on a story most would rather forget. And if you're ready for more raw, unfiltered African history, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to hear, few dare to say out loud. This is Folktales Cinema, where history isn't sanitized, but revealed. Before the first empires fell, before iron chains scraped against human flesh, before the world carved invisible lines into maps that bled borders across the earth, there was Africa. Not the broken image many have been taught to see. Not the desperate, impoverished, war-torn shell that propaganda often projects, but the beginning. The cradle where humanity first opened its eyes beneath a sun that burned like a golden god above the endless plains. It was here beneath ancient skies that the first breath was drawn, the first heartbeat pulsed, the first thought sparked in the mind of man. Africa was not just a land, it was life itself. But here's where the fear began. Because when the rest of the world stumbled upon this truth that the very people they would later call lesser were in fact the very origin of mankind, the world trembled. The first human beings were black, their skin kissed by the sun, their roots buried deep in African soil. The blueprint of civilization was not born in Europe or Asia or the towering temples of foreign gods. It was born beneath acacia trees and red clay rivers. Born to people whose stories would one day be silenced for daring to exist first. Long before the sails of foreign ships appeared on distant horizons, before shackles gleamed beneath the burning sky, Africa was a beacon. Its kingdoms stretched like veins across the body of the continent. The Nubians, the Kushites, the Kemetic priests of Kemet, what the world would later call Egypt, the people of Axum, of Congo, of Mali, of Songhai, of Ife, of Benin. They built cities that pulsed with trade, wisdom, and spiritual power. Their knowledge was not whispered superstition. It was carved into stone, engraved upon obelisks that still stabbed defiantly into the heavens. It was etched into scrolls, painted onto walls, and encoded into oral histories passed down for generations. They were mathematicians before Pythagoras was born. They were astronomers who mapped the stars while others still wandered beneath them blind. They practiced medicine that rivaled and often surpassed the best that Europe would discover centuries later. Even the sands of time, relentless and cruel, could not fully erase their mark. But the world was not ready for this truth. Because when you realize that Black people were not at the margins of history, but at its core, everything changes. If Africans were the first, if their civilizations laid the foundation for what would later be called progress, then what happens to the myth of superiority built by those who came after? It collapses. The lie that blackness equaled primitiveness shatters beneath the weight of Africa's undeniable genius. If Africa stood at the dawn of medicine, mathematics, philosophy, agriculture, navigation, if the very architecture of the world's religions borrowed from African spirituality, then those who built their empires on conquest, colonization, and slavery would be forced to confront a truth far more terrifying than war: that their dominance was stolen, not earned. And so, fear took root. No, this fear was not born from Africa's weakness. It was born from Africa's power. Because if Africa stood first, who truly held the rightful crown? The world's response was not dialogue. It was not respect. It was not gratitude. It was erasure. Where they could not match African achievement, they rewrote the record. Where they could not dismiss African wisdom, they labeled it myth. Where they could not comprehend African spirituality, they called it paganism. The gods of the Nile became demons. The philosophies of Ifo became witchcraft. The sacred science of the Dogon became fantasy. And slowly, Africa's children were taught to forget who they were. But even in the ancient world, outsiders could not ignore Africa's brilliance. The Greek historian Herodotus, whom Western academia calls the father of history, once stood in awe of the Ethiopians, describing them as tall, powerful, and advanced in sciences that surpassed even the Greeks themselves. Arab travelers journeyed across the Sahara and spoke breathlessly of empires shimmering with gold, cities pulsing with music, order, and wisdom. Chinese sailors wrote of African kings who ruled with justice and built empires as stable as any in Asia. They admired, but they also feared. Because admiration, unchecked, becomes dangerous when power is involved. The more the world saw Africa's potential, the more anxious it became. The narrative had to change. Suddenly, the builders of pyramids became savages. The creators of written language became illiterate. The architects of medicine became primitive. The masters of complex social structures became tribal. Their history was buried, sometimes literally. Artifacts were stolen, locked behind glass in foreign museums. Sacred texts were destroyed. Entire lineages were broken. Languages outlawed. Ceremonies forbidden. The world could not afford for Africa's true legacy to be known. Because to acknowledge it would be to admit a debt, a moral, cultural, intellectual debt owed to the continent they pillaged. And that truth was simply too dangerous. You see, this was never just about resources. Yes, Africa's soil bled diamonds, gold, oil, ivory. Yes, its people were chained and sold across oceans. Yes, its lands were carved up like meat at a butcher's table. But beneath the economics was something far more insidious: control of the narrative. If Africa's light could be dimmed, if her people could be convinced they were nothing but slaves, servants, and savages, then the world could justify everything that came next. The genocide, the colonization, the psychological warfare that still echoes in boardrooms, textbooks, news broadcasts, and government policies today. Because even now, to be black in many parts of the world is to walk through systems not built for you, but built on top of you. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, never dies. Every time a black child discovers who their ancestors truly were, every time an African historian unearths a hidden record, every time a storyteller speaks the unspeakable on platforms like this one, the lie begins to crack. Because you cannot silence a continent forever. You cannot erase the blood that flows through every human vein, blood that began here. Africa was not discovered. Africa discovered itself. The world didn't give Africa life. Africa gave life to the world. The erasure of African brilliance was never random. It wasn't an accident of ignorance or misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, ruthless. From the very beginning, the suppression of Africa's truth was never about misunderstanding who Africans were. It was about silencing who they might become. Because that origin story, the real one, is far from broken or fragile. It is terrifying. Terrifying to the empires who built themselves on sand, not stone. This was never a tale of weakness. This was always a story of power. And power, when it does not beg for permission, becomes the most dangerous thing of all. When those foreign ships first arrived, they did not see Africa as a blank slate. They saw wealth. They saw strength. They saw something they could never fully dominate unless they shattered it at its roots. The black body became central to this fear, feared for its resilience, exploited for its endurance, controlled for its potential. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the endless cotton fields of the American South, African bodies were ripped from their homeland and treated not as people but as tools, machines, commodities. But beneath the whips, beneath the chains, beneath the forced labor, what they truly feared was never just the strength of African backs. They feared the possibility that one day these strong bodies would rise with free minds. Because strength paired with consciousness is revolutionary, the colonizers created a narrative, a poisonous story that survives even now. They called Africans strong but simple, resilient but mindless, powerful but controllable. These weren't descriptions. They were weapons, psychological tools used to justify enslavement. They feel less pain. They're built for labor. They're incapable of ruling themselves. This wasn't ignorance. It was manipulation. By exaggerating African physical strength while diminishing African intellect, colonizers planted a seed that still poisons minds worldwide. A lie that allowed them to chain bodies while claiming moral superiority. But let's strip away the lies. They never feared African weakness. They feared what would happen if African strength ever paired with African self-determination. Look at sports. Look at music. Look at warfare. Even today, black excellence often triggers suspicion, not celebration. Black athletes dominate global stages but are met with scrutiny, accusations, and controversy. Black soldiers fought wars for nations that denied them basic rights. Black musicians birthed the sounds that defined entire cultures, only to have their voices stolen, whitewashed, repackaged. Because excellence without control becomes dangerous to oppressive systems. It threatens the world order. The fear of black physicality wasn't invented in the plantation era. Even ancient records trembled before it. Roman texts described Nubians as fierce, unbreakable warriors. Arab historians marveled at the stamina of East African traders who crossed vast deserts unyielding. European slave traders, while dehumanizing Africans, still fixated obsessively on their strength and endurance. But here's the chilling truth. That admiration turned into fear. The myth of the superhuman African was born. Even today, we hear echoes of it. Black people are naturally athletic. They're physically gifted. On the surface, it sounds like flattery. But beneath the surface, it's another tool of control. A subtle way to erase intellect, emotion, complexity, and reduce an entire people to physical vessels. This is why, even today, a black man walking through certain neighborhoods is seen as a threat. A black woman's body is hypersexualized, yet deemed too strong to need protection. The African body has become a battlefield. Not just physically, but symbolically. Because a strong people, once aware of their full strength, mental, spiritual, and physical, become unstoppable. And so for centuries, entire systems have been built to keep African strength reactive, but never revolutionary. But not all weapons are made of steel. Some are made of silence. Long before the ships, before the chains, Africa thrived as a global center of learning. Great Zimbabwe's architecture still defies explanation. The Dogon people mapped celestial bodies. Western astronomers wouldn't find for centuries. Ancient Egypt. Kemet mastered medicine, mathematics, and spirituality millennia before Europe. But ask most students today, and Africa's story begins with slavery. Why? Because knowledge is power. And African knowledge was too dangerous to remain visible. So they burned libraries. They outlawed languages. They criminalized African spiritual systems. They erased names like Imhotep, the true father of medicine, long before Hippocrates. They diminished Timbuktu, where hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covered every major science. They buried the truth of Kemet, falsely claiming it as a European or Middle Eastern invention. The goal was simple. If Africa's intellectual achievements were acknowledged, the entire hierarchy of white supremacy would crumble. You cannot enslave a people who know they invented surgery before you invented soap. You cannot colonize a land whose children know their ancestors spoke to the stars, while yours still feared the night. You cannot dominate a culture whose worldview honors land, spirit, and time as sacred. So they made reading illegal for enslaved Africans. They rewrote the textbooks. They labeled African religion as witchcraft and African science as superstition. But they failed. Because Africa's story survived hidden in whispers, songs, braids, drum beats, and oral tales passed down from mother to child. Our knowledge was not lost. It was waiting. And now it is rising. Today, African-centered education is resurging. Ancestral healing practices are returning. The diaspora is reclaiming art, history, and power. Because once you awaken to the genius of Africa's true legacy, you realize why it had to be silenced. And you realize what happens when that silence is finally shattered. You see, fear has always followed African people, not because they were weak, but because they refused to stay broken. Across centuries, across oceans, across brutal regimes, every time the system tried to crush the African soul, it rose stronger. Let's speak of rebellion. When we hear rebellion, we think of the famous few: Nat Turner, Queen Yaa Asantewaa, Toussaint Louverture. But these are just fragments of a far greater mosaic. Captives leaping from slave ships into dark waters rather than be enslaved. Revolts across the Americas from Bahia to Barbados. African kingdoms fortifying cities. Training warriors, devising codes to defend against foreign invaders. The Zulu Empire under Shaka Zulu reshaped warfare itself. The Kingdom of Dahomey unleashed the Agoge, an all-female military feared across continents. The Maroons carved sovereign territories in Jamaica and Suriname, defying colonial armies for generations. But Africa's resistance was never just about weapons. It was spiritual. It was cultural. It was psychological. Messages were hidden in drum beats. Escape routes braided into children's hair. Sacred deities disguised as Catholic saints. Liberation songs encoded in Christian hymns. Because how do you enslave a people who believe their ancestors walked beside them? You can break their bodies, but never their souls. This is why every act of African resistance terrified colonizers. Because colonial power relies on submission, and African resistance whispered a dangerous truth. You may chain my body, but my spirit remains free. Even today, that truth echoes. From the streets of Ferguson to the protests in Lagos, from Johannesburg to Baltimore, from Cape Town to Paris, there is a fire that refuses to be extinguished. This is why African resistance is still labeled radical, violent, dangerous. Because it speaks a truth that makes oppressive systems tremble. Freedom is not granted, it is taken. And African people have always known how to take it. But the most terrifying part for global powers is not the past. It's the present and the future. The colonialists may have left, but the systems they built remain. Economic extraction continues. Cultural theft continues. Manipulation of narratives continues. Even today, Africa's natural wealth fuels global industries. Its resources power the world, but its people are too often left behind. Multinational corporations extract billions. Priceless artifacts sit in European museums. Cultural expressions are repackaged, resold, and stripped of credit. But Africa is waking up. Because African identity was never just geographic. It is cultural. It is spiritual. It is revolutionary. It refuses to be boxed. It refuses to be commodified. It refuses to forget. And that is what the world fears most. The game has changed. For centuries, Africa's wealth was taken. Her voice was silenced. Her children scattered across continents, chained first by slavery, then by systems of control, far more subtle and invisible. But now, something is happening. A new Africa is awakening. And with each beat of this awakening, the world feels the tremor. Because what was once dismissed, what was once buried, is now becoming impossible to ignore. The resistance is no longer just on battlefields or in history books. It now echoes through speakers, dances across stages, flows in code written by young African programmers, and shines on runways where bold, unapologetic African fashion reclaims its global presence. Afrobeats, once a local rhythm, now pulses across every corner of the earth. The infectious beats of Burna Boy, Wizkid, Tems, Rema, and countless others have broken past every border. They aren't just creating music, they are reshaping culture itself. And the world, once the gatekeeper, now finds itself dancing to Africa's rhythm. But this isn't only entertainment, this is revolution. In the face of centuries of attempted erasure, something extraordinary is happening. Africa is choosing itself. The modern African isn't begging for validation from the West anymore. They're reclaiming their languages, wearing their ancestral symbols, and reviving spiritual practices once demonized by colonial rule. The kente cloth, the isi agbada, the gale head wrap, the cowrie shells that once served as currency now adorn the necks of royalty reborn. These are no longer symbols of the past. They are declarations of identity. Every thread, every drumbeat, every word spoken in Yoruba, Swahili, Zulu, Igbo, Wolof is an act of defiance. Because every time an African person chooses authenticity over assimilation, they are reminding the world of a power that cannot be caged. And that is what terrifies those who once controlled the narrative. The African identity was never supposed to survive this long. It was supposed to be broken, rewritten, repackaged into something comfortable for Western consumption, an exotic costume to be worn, but never truly respected. But it didn't break. It adapted. It endured. And now it rises. The more Africa embraces its authentic self, the more it exposes the lie that superiority ever belonged elsewhere. Because this identity, rooted in resilience, connection to the earth, and unshakable communal strength, cannot be bought or sold. It doesn't fit into the molds of capitalism or Western conformity. It threatens to unravel a global system carefully constructed on hierarchies that placed Africa at the bottom. And yet, Africa rises not to dominate, but to reclaim. African entrepreneurs are building tech empires from Silicon Savannah to Yaba Valley. Content creators are telling their own stories unfiltered, uncolonized, unapologetic. African literature isn't just read by Africans anymore, it's shaping global thought. From Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's bold words to the poetic philosophies of Ben Okri and the fearless voices of new generations, African intellectual power is undeniable. African cinema no longer waits for Hollywood's permission. It builds its own stage. Nollywood, once dismissed, now ranks among the most prolific film industries in the world. And African fashion? It no longer asks to be included. It leads. Designers like Kenneth Ives, Makio, and countless others are not following trends, they are setting them. Their work honors ancient traditions while boldly carving out the future. But beneath all this cultural renaissance lies something far more dangerous to those who still wish to control: economic power. For decades, Africa's resources built the fortunes of other nations. Gold, oil, cobalt, rare earth minerals, extracted, shipped, and sold while Africa received pennies. But that era is fracturing. The black dollar, once scattered and underestimated, is being realized for what it truly is: a force. The global African diaspora is uniting its spending power, investing in African businesses, and creating wealth that no longer flows outward, but circulates within African hands. African nations are forging their own trade agreements, building cross-border partnerships, and refusing to be pawns in old imperial games. The more Africa controls its own wealth, the less the world can dictate her fate. And the resistance isn't only economic. On the streets, young Africans are rising, challenging corrupt governments, demanding accountability, fighting for democracy that serves the people, not foreign interests. Movements like EndSARS in Nigeria, Fees Must Fall in South Africa, and countless others reflect a generation unwilling to be silenced. They aren't just fighting for policy changes. They are fighting for dignity. Because they know what their ancestors knew, that freedom isn't given, it's taken. And this terrifies global powers who still benefit from Africa's submission. Because the more Africa claims her voice, her space, and her wealth, the more the world is forced to acknowledge Africa as an equal, not as a charity case. You see, this has always been the core of the global anxiety around African power, the fear of losing control. The narrative of African inferiority was never truly about Africa's failures. It was about the world's fear of African success. If Africa could rise after everything it has endured, the slavery, the colonization, the systemic racism, the cultural erasure, the resource theft, if after all of that, Africa still rises, what does that say about the very systems that tried to destroy her? It exposes them for what they are: fragile, manipulative, and terrified. But here's the truth that cannot be suppressed. Africa's power does not come from domination. It comes from its connection to the land, from its unbreakable bond between generations, from its endless well of creativity, from its spiritual grounding, a wisdom older than pyramids, older than kings, older than conquest itself. Africa's power is rooted in life, in survival and rebirth. Every time an African baby takes their first breath, the legacy continues. Every harvest, every drumbeat, every language still spoken. It all screams, we are still here. And so, as we reach this point in our journey on folktale cinema, we must understand this is not simply history. This is war not of guns, but of narratives. It is a war for identity, for dignity, for truth. The global perception of Africa has always been shaped by who controlled the pen, who told the story. But that era is dying. Because today, Africans are telling their own stories. We are reclaiming the pen. And the ink flows with truth the world can no longer ignore. Africa's story was never one of helpless victims. It has always been one of strength, of survival, of spiritual resilience. The idea that African people were a threat was never born from their weakness. It was born from their power, a power that echoes across oceans, across centuries, across bloodlines that still carry the memory of what was stolen and what can never be fully taken. The world may have tried to erase Africa's place at the table, but Africa is not asking for a seat anymore. She is building her own table. And as her children rise both on the continent and across the diaspora, the world must finally recognize Africa's wisdom, strength, and beauty are not relics of the past. They are forces shaping our present and forging our future. This has been a journey into the heart of a narrative long suppressed, a truth deliberately dimmed. We've seen how fear, not weakness, has shaped the world's gaze upon Africa, leading to centuries of erasure and exploitation. But as the sun sets on this chapter of our story, a new dawn breaks. The echoes of ancient drums are no longer confined to history books. They pulse through the vibrant beats of Afrobeats, resonating in every corner of the globe. The wisdom carved into stone now flows through the code of young African programmers, building empires in Silicon Savannah and Yaba Valley. The stories once silenced are now boldly told by uncolonized voices in literature and cinema, reshaping global thought. Africa is not just reclaiming its past, it is powerfully forging its future. From the streets where young Africans demand dignity and accountability, to boardrooms where economic power is being unified and redirected, a revolution is underway. This isn't just about resources or wealth. It's about the unquantifiable power of identity, resilience, and a people who refuse to be erased. The systems of control, built on fragile myths of superiority, are trembling. For when Africa, with its unbreakable spirit and timeless wisdom, rises not to dominate but to reclaim its rightful place, the world is forced to confront its own carefully constructed illusions. The fear that once fueled the suppression of African brilliance now faces an unstoppable force, a continent choosing itself, unapologetically and authentically. So, as we conclude this revealing chapter, ask yourself, if Africa's true power lies not in dominance, but in its unparalleled capacity for resilience, creation, and rebirth, what does that mean for the future of humanity itself? The conversation has just begun. Continue to seek the truths that have been hidden. And if you're ready to peel back more layers of untold history, if you crave raw, unfiltered narratives that challenge the status quo, then hit that like button, subscribe to Folktales Cinema, and turn on notifications. Because every week new stories drop, and few dare to say them out loud. We are Folktales Cinema, where history isn't sanitized, but revealed.